We talked about the New South last time. We talked about Henry Grady and his speech about the funeral in Pickens County, saying we've got these resources. Why don't we have the industry to exploit them? And these industrial promoters did succeed, and there were certain industries that grew significantly in the South. First was the textile industry. We grew a lot of cotton in the South, and so we thought, well, the cotton's here, why don't we go ahead and make the cloth here? And so textile production soared. It made use of the cotton, water power, low taxes, low wages, conservative governments. The companies come in and build all these mills. Here we see some child laborers working on a giant machine, barefoot, in Macon, Georgia. The next growth industry in the South was tobacco processing. Just like with textiles and cotton, we grow the tobacco here. Why shouldn't we go ahead and make the cigarettes and other tobacco products here? The champion of this was, of course, James B. Duke, whose American Tobacco Company became incredibly dominant in the tobacco industry, centered around Durham, North Carolina. Among other brands, American Tobacco made Lucky Strikes. Here we see a physician promoting the benefits of smoking Lucky Strike cigarettes. Duke became, of course, very rich. He was our very own Southern oligarch and used his wealth to endow a small teaching college called Peabody College and turned it into Duke University, our Southern version of an Ivy League school. Growth industry number 3, iron and steel. I've already talked about the fact that Birmingham is one of the best places in the world for making iron and steel because of all the resources that are right here. Birmingham is called it was founded in 1871 or 72, I'm not sure, after the war. It's called the Magic City because it grew so magically fast. It was like one of those cities in China today. It didn't exist, and by 1920 it was the second largest city in the South because of steel growth. New Orleans, by the way, was number 1. Here we see some company housing for the mill workers in the South. And this was significant for the South. The South produced a fifth of the national capacity for steel by 1890. Growth industry number 4, and finally, railroads. Just as railroads were incredibly important in the North, the West, they were the largest industry in the Gilded Age. They were a major growth industry in the South as well. In fact, railroads increased far greater in the South than the nation at large. In fact, railroad mileage doubled between only 1880 and 1890. Now, while that's a great success story, part of that is because the South had very few railroads to begin with, and most of what few railroads we had were destroyed by Union armies, so we were kind of starting from ground zero, so the absolute numbers look impressive, but still, it was an important growth factor. Now, despite all these industries, despite all this, industrialization was always small compared to the North. In the last 20 years of the 19th century, our industrial capacity doubled, sounds big, on an absolute basis, to 10% of the national total. We still were just 10% of the national total in 1900, and that was our 1860 figure. We were 10% of the total industrial output in 1860. So it took us 40 years to get back to that, and all the capital, the money to build those railroads, the textile mills, the steel mills, that came from the North. It was a form of monetary colonization, so we were still poor. And the South was still primarily agrarian, and there were problems of tenantry and debt peonage and reliance on a few cash crops instead of a diversified agricultural system. What do I mean by the term debt peonage? I mean a system of debt which keeps people in a virtual form of serfdom. During Reconstruction, immediately after the war, approximately a third of farmers were tenants. So 2/3 of farmers in the South were landowners. By 1900, however, 70% of the farmers in the South were tenants, and less than a third actually owned their lands. The crop lien system cost many farmers their lands. So what is the crop lien system? Well, after the Civil War, farmers in the South had little cash. The crop lien system was a way for farmers to get credit before the planting season by borrowing against the value for anticipated harvest. So local merchants provided food and supplies all year long on credit. And when the cotton crop was harvested, farmers would turn it over to the merchant to pay back their loan. Sometimes there was cash left over. But when cotton prices were low, the crop did not cover the debt, and the farmer started the next year in the red. Eventually, he could lose his land. Many did, and that's why we see this reduction in the amount of land ownership. Now that's an example of landowners, crop lien system for landowners. There were two other kind of iterations of how this might work. One was sharecroppers, and sharecropping is a system of agriculture in which a landowner allows a tenant to use the land in return for a share of the crop produced on the land. For example, 50% of the crop. Sharecropping has a long history, and there are a wide range of different situations and types of agreements that have encompass the system. There's a clear link to slavery here. After the war, we have these millions of black freedmen. Most don't own land. Some did end up with land, but most don't. Their only skill is working in agriculture. The white landowners don't have any laborers, and so the solution sort of presents itself. Now, not all sharecroppers were black. Many of them were white too, poor whites and blacks. And these situations were complex. Sometimes they were exploitative. Clearly, they seem reminiscent of slavery, but sometimes they weren't. My own grandfather in the 1920s and 30s ran a farm in Pickens County, Alabama. It was a small farm, less than 100 acres. He had two daughters. My mother was one of them. And to help him run the farm, there was a small family of African-American sharecroppers lived on this small farm, and they did the work together. They shared the meager profits. They shared the milk from the cow. They shared a lot of meals together. And so I would like to think that was not a particularly exploitative situation, but some were, and it's complex. Now, the third form, tenant farmers, are just is when you reside on farmland that's owned by a landlord. And depending on the contract, tenants can make payments to the owner of either a fixed portion of the product, cash, or some combination. And this has been common in the U.S. from the 1870s forward. Tenants typically brought their own tools and animals. They were unlike sharecroppers. So tenant farmers were one little step up the system. But regardless of which system, you had these merchants and bankers basically kind of controlling the system, and it resulted in a real transformation of the southern backcountry. Subsistence farming became more difficult. The crop lien system meant that backcountry farmers tried to grow cash crops for money, often unsuccessfully. When I say backcountry, I'm talking about the northern half of Alabama that's kind of hilly, places that wouldn't have been great for plantations, but were dominated by subsistence farmers who were quite happy, despite not having a lot of cash before the war. But now they're trying to grow cash crops to pay back their loans. And they'd also survived, and it's difficult, they'd also survived before by raising livestock, pigs or cows, but commercial agricultural opposition to free roaming closed that option, so subsistence farming became harder, even as profit opportunities remained rare. The majority of Southern people still involved in agriculture, therefore remained very, very poor.